Welcome to Tardisian Files. Bit of a no-brainer, but if you haven't watched this episode yet, be aware of spoilers ahead. Susan Triad. S Triad. S Triad Technologies. Sue Triad Technologies. Sue Tech. Sue Tech. Okay. Really did not see that one coming. Now that I've got your attention, we're going to be reviewing The Legend of Ruby Sunday. I will be doing a full review of the finale when The Empire of Death has aired, but for now I'll be reviewing the episode as a standalone. So without further ado, let's get into it. Starting with the overview, the Doctor and Ruby arrive at Unit HQ, meeting Kate Stewart, Rose Noble, Colonel Ibrahim, Morris Gibbons, and Harriet, head of Archive. After introductions, the Doctor jumps right in with telling Unit why he's here. Everywhere he's travelled, a woman has appeared. Susan Twist's elusive character. Unit revealed to him that they have also noticed her. A woman called Susan Triad, CEO of S Triad Technologies, set to launch her new software worldwide for free. The Doctor and Unit all notice several things at once. 1. S Triad being an anagram for TARDIS, and 2. Her name, Susan, just like the Doctor's granddaughter. Unit also show the Doctor a live feed from Susan's rehearsal for her launch speech, where they see Mel Bush working undercover on the media team. Shockingly, there's no alien signals or traces of extraterrestrial tech in the S-Triad software, and Susan Triad herself is the polar opposite of what you'd expect from a tech mogul. She's a lovely lady. The Doctor also explains to Unit about Ruby's mysterious past, how they cannot find any trace of her birth mother, and to complicate things, they cannot go back to Christmas Eve 2004 now to find out, because the Doctor has already been there once, and the event has now become a fixed point in time. So, such an incursion would create a dirty great paradox at the worst time and place to create a paradox. Morris suggests that Susan Triad may be Ruby's mother, though Unit dismiss it as statistically Susan would have been past the age range of women who give up their children in the way Ruby was abandoned. Harriet suggests that instead they use earthly means to look back in time, using the CCTV footage of which Ruby has a copy of at her mother's house. While Ruby is taken home by Unit, accompanied by Rose, Mel initiates a DNA scan of Susan at the S-Triad headquarters, while on a break from rehearsal before making her way back to Unit. At home, Ruby retrieves the VHS tape with her mother insisting on coming to Unit with her, so they get Mrs. Flood to come up and look after Ruby's grandmother. After a round of backhanded compliments from the downstairs neighbour, the three women leave. However, Mrs. Flood ominously warns Mrs. Sunday of a storm coming, and her demeanour changes to being more sinister, just as a very unnatural thundercloud rolls over London. "He waits no more," she says. Back at Unit, Mel arrives and greets the Doctor and Kate and uploads her DNA scan of Susan Triad, 100% human. No surprise there. Ruby and Rose arrive shortly after, causing the Doctor to switch his attention back to Ruby's own mystery. After getting Kate to admit that Unit indeed does have a time window, despite the third and fourth Doctors telling them explicitly not to develop one, which of course he knew they would regardless, they head down to the time window, where they meet Colonel Chigozi, who accompanies them into the machine. Morris links it up to the VHS tape of 2004, and they're able to project a sort of ghost of the past in a 3D hologram, which the Doctor and Ruby can interact with. But they must remain still because technically they are both in 2004 and 2024 at the same time. Wibbly wobbly timey-wimey stuff, eh? So, as they watch on, they see the hooded figure of Ruby's mother. However, they cannot see her face. The hood is completely dark, and not because of the time window glitching, but because the Doctor says it's like she's physically shadowed. They watch as history plays out as it did before, up until the point where the Doctor from 2023 arrives. At which point, Ruby's birth mother, who's facing away from the TARDIS, turns and points to him, just as she did in the flashback from Space Babies. She's also pointing northwest, but because they cannot see from the angle they're at, Colonel Chigozi checks for them, moving around the projection of the TARDIS, just out of their sight. As they watch Ruby's mother leave, Morris alerts them to something behind them, a swirling mass of smoke and thunder. What's more, Colonel Chigozi is gone. But then his voice begins to speak. He declares that the thing before them is lost, waiting, been waiting for so long. It's cut off when the overloading chronon surge renders the time window inactive, causing a massive concussive blast to damage the equipment. When the smoke clears, they find Chigozi, now a husk in the shape of a man comprised of dust, looking like he's been dead for 100 years. The Doctor and Mel head to S-Triad Technologies to speak with Susan. Meanwhile, Morris, Harriet, Ruby, Rose and Kate head back up to the Ops Centre to analyse the footage of the manifestation they saw. At S-Triad HQ, the Doctor meets Susan, who is still lovely as ever, and when the Doctor mentions the places he's seen her before, she becomes visibly shaken. She remembers every encounter that he mentions, saying that they keep her awake at night in her dreams. Back at Unit HQ, they run the image in reverse and they're shocked by what they see. At the centre of the maelstrom is the TARDIS, 20 metres away from where it was originally and surrounded by that thing. They send the image to Mel and the Doctor, and as they talk, they hear the TARDIS make the same groaning sound it has been making in every single adventure. Morris says, what if this was a trap? Except the trap is at Unit, and not at S-Triad HQ. What if the shape they saw is still surrounding the TARDIS, unseen by all of them, but now it's registering on a quantum scan? The Doctor orders Ruby to go down to the time window. On stage, Susan begins her speech, but, unheard by the others, the voice from before begins to speak in her head. Her speech begins to change, and Susan becomes disoriented. At the same time, back at Unit, Harriet begins to relay the same message, a mysterious being who's been lost for ages, now returning. The Doctor remembers something from his trip to 1963 and asks Kate what Harriet's full name is. Harriet Arbinger. Harbinger. Now gloating, the voice, through Susan and Harriet, declares that the being, their master and king, latched onto the TARDIS, and under its command, the TARDIS lured the Doctor to 2024. Meanwhile, in the time window, the machine switches back on again for Ruby, showing her 2004 once again. Now the voice, speaking through Harriet as Susan begins to convulse, begins to list the names of gods. The Toymaker, the Maestro, the Mara, the Trickster, Reprobate, the God of the Beast, Malice, Mischief, Misery, and above them all, the Mother and Father of the gods, the God of all gods. As the Doctor and Unit watch, they see the anagram of the screen change. Not S-Triad for TARDIS, but Su and Tech. Sutek, the God of Death, Osiren and old enemy of the Doctor. As Sutek manifests at Unit around the TARDIS in the form of a monstrous jackal, his harbingers, Harriet and Susan, begin to speak through him, their features now corpse-like and horrific, as he declares that he brings the gift of death onto humanity. Back at Unit, Ruby watches as the shadowy figure of her birth mother makes her way to her through the projection of 2004. Oh my goodness, so many pros for this episode. The first off being the twist, pun not intended, at the end. I am now kicking myself for dismissing the Sutekh theory earlier in my predictions. For those who don't know, Sutekh is an Osiran, a member of a godlike species from Phaester Osiris, who was imprisoned in a pyramid on Mars with the Eye of Horus holding him in suspended animation, which was being held in the deepest levels of the Pyramid of Giza on Earth. The reason I discounted him originally as being the one who waits is because the Osirans were originally described as powerful aliens with a distinct origin and a homeworld, rather than being beings with a more ambiguous past like the Toymaker or the Elder Gods. And also for the more obvious reason that Sutekh was supposed to have been killed by being aged to death by his own time corridor in the pyramids of Mars. Unbeknownst to me until today, when Sutekh's article on TARDIS Wiki doubled in size hours after the episode was released, it was only Sutekh's body that was destroyed. His consciousness fled, as shown in the Big Finish audios, and he rebuilt his body using an Osiran flesh loom. Thank you, TARDIS Wiki, for that. So now the main show actually has an opportunity to make further references to the audio story, although there may be a case of decanonisation for some of those stories as well. However, there were a lot of hints throughout this episode, and others, pointing to Sutekh. In this episode alone, you had Carla's reaction to the manifestation, where she said it was the Beast. Similar to Sarah Jane's reaction in the Pyramids of Mars when she saw Sutekh's face projected above the TARDIS console. Both of them knew he was evil, even if they didn't quite know who he was. Additionally, the idea that Sutekh controlled the TARDIS was another hint, as he drew the TARDIS off course in the Pyramids of Mars as well, to divert it towards 1911 rather than to 1980 where the Doctor had intended to go. And additionally, there were two hints in the Devil's Chord that the big bad was Sutekh. The Beatles song in the Musicless timeline had lyrics that went, "My dog's not dead." As Sutekh often manifests as a jackal, as he did in this episode, this was a subtle hint maybe. Although a more obvious hint, which we did mention earlier in this season of the podcast, is the similarities between the scenes in the Pyramids of Mars and the Devil's Chord, where the Doctor takes Sarah Jane and Ruby respectively to their own times to show them what would happen if they didn't stop the Maestro or Sutekh in the respective episodes. To be fair, that should have been more of a hint than I took it to be, but hey-ho. Sutekh aside, Susan Triad's mystery was also perfectly resolved in this episode. Not only did Russell keep many plates turning by having the Doctor believe that she was his granddaughter, but also the fact that she was a regular human, very nice, her company's software was clean, all had me on the edge of my seat. Having been a foreman skeptic, as I like to say, I knew that it was far too easy for Susan Triad to just be Susan. But the fact that Sutekh effectively played the Doctor right into his hands I thought was absolutely epic. It really was the perfect trap. And as an extension to this, the way the episode was written, it wasted no time into going down this alternate school of thinking for Unit and the Doctor, all believing that Susan Triad potentially was the Doctor's granddaughter, and only noticing that S Triad was an anagram of TARDIS, rather than focusing on S Triad technologies. All of this was presented to us in a way that threw us off until the last 10 minutes of the episode, when all of our assumptions went out the window with the reveal that it was actually Sutekh who was behind it all. It almost felt like we as the audience were drawn into the same trap as the Doctor was, and I was absolutely blown away. I really enjoyed watching this episode, and I enjoyed being duped by this episode because I was completely drawn in. Apart from the fact of it being Susan, I genuinely thought that the episode would take a completely different turn, but it didn't. I also really liked that we got to see Unit again in this episode, and I also liked the fact that we were introduced to the character of Morris. Lenny Rush is undoubtedly one of the most talented young actors to date, so it was really great to see him in this role and do an amazing job of portraying a child prodigy in a very adult-dominated setting. You almost forget that he actually is a 13-year-old. Additionally, I love to see Yasmin Finney return as Rose Noble. I'm not entirely sure why a 16-year-old is working at Unit, but technically she's old enough to work, and there's still all that ambiguity around Rose's age anyway, so I'm not going to question it. Because regardless, it was nice to see that Rose is still very much functioning part of the story, a part of Unit, and very relevant to the storyline as one of my favourite characters. Another fun aspect of this episode was the time window. Not only did it help get around the problem of crossing one's own time stream, but it kind of helped prolong the mystery of Ruby's birth mother, which I am glad, since we knew we'd probably find out who Ruby's birth mother was in the finale, but it felt like, given the pace of this episode, it wasn't immediately relevant to the plot, so it kind of kept that wheel turning just for a little bit longer, bringing us a little bit closer to the truth, but just enough so that we are poised to find out in the next episode rather than focusing too much of it on this episode. And speaking of writing tactfully, the whole S-triad anagram being the wrong anagram made for the perfect reveal. As I said, I wasn't expecting Sutek, and it's quite obvious that even though the theory had been circulating online, Russell wanted to throw us off the scent as best as he could by giving us several red herrings, including the anagram, and this I think was one of his biggest and smartest outmaneuvers to date. Not to mention the whole Harriet Arbinger thing, while it is a bit of a predictable element of the show after The Devil's Cord, but it is still nice to see that Russell was being concise and consistent with these harbingers. And another interesting cliffhanger was Mrs. Flood. Not only was it nice to see her true colours finally emerge, but it reminded all of us of the third mystery woman next to Susan Triad and Ruby's birth mother. Who is Mrs. Flood? Is she also an acolyte of Sutek, or is she an acolyte of something much, much worse? And speaking of Sutek, the eagle-eyed of fans may have noticed that the original voice actor of Sutek, Gabriel Wolfe, hasn't reappeared in the credits. And likely as an unintentional link to the Great Old Ones, he's the same voice actor who voiced Sutek originally, as well as voicing the Beast in the Satan Pit. You gotta love it when the writers keep the encores true to the original source material. Also, during the reveal at the end, certain big bads from Days Long Gone all got a mention to be part of the Pantheon, most notably the Mara and the Trickster. There had been many theories linking these two individuals to the plot of this season and to the Pantheon, and while it's unlikely that we'll see them back on the big screen, it made for a very nice throwback for those who loved the Sarah Jane adventures and also loved classic her. Frustrating, given the fact that her mystery has actually been pretty underdeveloped thus far. It's not like Susan Twist's mystery, where she had a cameo pretty much in every episode. There's been very little focus on Mrs. Flood. She sort of fell to the wayside during the episodes. So it really does come into question, who is she? And are we ever actually going to find out what her involvement is, or is it just going to be implied in this episode and not really picked up again? And then of course there is the elephant in the room. So Susan Triad wasn't Susan, but she technically also wasn't the big bad of the series at all, just a servant of him. Now don't get me wrong, revealing Sutek through Susan Triad was a twist that no one saw coming, but on the flip side, it was a little bit underwhelming that Triad is just a mouthpiece for the real villain. But still, no shade, it was an epic twist. Now, I did have a couple of cons to this episode, not many and not very big, but here we go. My first, and this is me being a little bit pernickety, is the idea of Sutekh as being the head of the Pantheon. He's not a metaphysical being like the Toymaker and Maestro were. He has a home planet, he's a being of flesh, and he has a distinct origin in this universe. He may have godlike powers, but I find it unlikely that a sentient being raised to godlike level would be able to commandeer the control of a pantheon of actual gods. Though it is possible that since many of these beings mentioned in the pantheon are beings that cannot enter the universe without being invited or exploiting others, it is possible that Sutekh's status as a godlike being native to this universe may have been what allowed him to take control. Additionally, the prolonged mystery of Mrs. Flood, where we still don't know for certain whether she's aligned with Sutekh, is a little bit frustrating given the fact that her mystery has actually been pretty underdeveloped thus far. It's not like Susan Twist's mystery, where she had a cameo pretty much in every episode. There's been very little focus on Mrs. Flood. She sort of fell to the wayside during the episodes. So it really does come into question, who is she? And are we ever actually going to find out what her involvement is, or is it just going to be implied in this episode and not really picked up again? And then of course there is the elephant in the room. So Susan Triad wasn't Susan, but she technically also wasn't the big bad of the series at all, just a servant of him. Now don't get me wrong, revealing Sutekh through Susan Triad was a twist that no one saw coming, but on the flip side, it was a little bit underwhelming that Triad is just a mouthpiece for the real villain. But still, no shade, it was an epic twist. Overall, I cannot wait for the finale. I think this episode really helped to set up the series finale very well and has left us all hungry for answers. There was the reveal at the end of the episode, which came as a genuine surprise to me, and it also set up several other mysteries which we can only hope get solved in the next episode. I'm very curious to see how the Doctor will defeat Sutekh this time. I'm curious to see how Mrs. Flood ties into all of this. And above all, I'm really looking forward to seeing how Ruby's mystery will tie into all of it. But what did you guys think of the episode? Is there something you liked? Is there something you didn't like? Is there something we missed? Did we gloss over it? Let us know in the comments section on your favourite podcast streaming app, or head over to our Instagram and TikTok pages at Tardisian Files Podcasts and let us know in the comments for the promotional content for this episode. Hope you enjoyed listening to this episode, everyone, and as always, see you next time on Tardisian Files.